for them, that question of my job or my safety, either way, is such a detrimental question for them, right? To not work and not have a job, that might be in their minds, like basically destroying their safety. I always worried about this issue in general when it first started. So like I would go, and I'm talking like late March now. So I would go to a grocery store. They're not really sure what they're doing, whatever, but we got to have the grocery stores open.
Yeah.
And I would go in there and I'm like, there's nothing protecting these employees. And you're starting to talk about social distancing, but we have to interact with them as the cashier or getting stuff or ordering stuff. And it didn't seem like it was a big priority. Or even like one time I went to, let me see how McDonald's is working. And they looked, and no gloves, nothing, or that was at that time. And you first saw with the grocery store workers like Kroger, where I think it's the United Food and Commercial Workers Union negotiated with Kroger about various safety things, extra pay, things like that. And that suggested that might be the only way to really kind of deal with this, because a lot of the workers are vulnerable.
I agree with you. I do think that having a union negotiate on behalf of all of the workers is the only real way to sort these things out.
I think employers are a bit scared about what's the best way to do this. They may not even have the architectural methodologies to even do some of these things regarding social distancing, and yet they want to get back to business. So if the government is giving them a kind of a window of opportunity by saying, well, yeah, there's guidelines, but you won't be liable. We just do the best you can and get those businesses back in line.
Right. I mean, I think that's the other thing that's unusual about workplace safety law is that it presumes a muscular federal agency to enforce it. Like, it's not like other employment laws where employees enforce it through lawsuits. It's like your remedy is to call OSHA.
And we've seen this in all other kinds of federal law, where the agency or even the federal law isn't really helpful. So I know that there was the first lawsuit that was filed regarding employees in the meat industry. They went into state court and they tried to make an argument under state law. Now, of course, the employer was arguing something about preemption and OSHA, but it got such publicity about the number of people in that industry who had been subjected, that it was more the public issue became more of a concern than a legal issue. But the legal issue was the way they got it out there. And even what the AFL-CIO has done by filing a lawsuit to try and get OSHA to act, I mean, it doesn't seem like those are great legal remedies. It's more what happens is the publicity that comes from them.
For workers who aren't unionized, what would be a good process for dealing with this?
So I think what employers should do, because I think there are some employers who really are concerned about this too. I think what employers could do is they could implement mediation programs and suggest that workers who believe they have legitimate concerns bring in a mediator to kind of facilitate the concerns the employer has and the employee has. Because there could be some employees, I mean, it's really difficult if your posture is, I can't come back to work until there's a vaccine. I don't have any immunities. I don't live with anybody. I'm just worried about catching this, right? So then what's the employer's responsibility if that's your position? I could see like some incentives, right? If you have employed mediation, if you've done that, maybe that would be an argument for reducing liability.
What about like an ADA style, employer obligation to engage in the interactive process, reasonably accommodate people's concerns or, their family risks at home beyond just their own medical conditions. What about that as like a procedural approach?
I think that's one of the general criticisms that's going on now anyway, about like opening back up and getting the economy started, that most of the criticism you hear about that is, I don't hear like worker safety as a primary concern. It's more like acceptable number of deaths, acceptable number of people. And so if your orientation is more the other way, right, where you have a duty to, and you would think like, well, there's the general duty clause, but we were talking about what that means for OSHA. But if you have a duty to kind of accommodate, and certainly there will be some of that, because there will be the people, I guess, who have all certain vulnerabilities already or whatever, may already have some ADA issues that require that there be some kind of accommodation. In fact, when Texas was coming back, and the one particular group that I had raised a question about, what about someone who is completely healthy, not at risk, but they live with someone who is? Because then they come home and they're in contact with that person. But at least in Texas, what they said is they would look at those on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
And so it really comes down to, for the basic individual employee, my job versus my safety. And how do you make that call? And most of the lower level workers, and I think that's why you have a lot of information about a lot of people being affected tend to be minority workers, because most of the lower level, initially they were saying, were the essential workers, right? So not just the first responders, but like people who work in the transportation industry and buses and all these things we need, and even in the grocery stores and all that. Well, for them, that question of my job or my safety, either way, is such a detrimental question for them, right? To not work and not have a job, that might be in their minds like basically destroying their safety, because they have no livelihood. And so when they're faced with those choices, it'd be nice to have someone who can negotiate for you or mediate